Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jane Sánchez, and I have the honor of serving as the 25th Law Librarian of Congress. Welcome to the Library of Congress. We are very pleased to, I'm sorry, you can't hear me? Okay. We're very pleased to host you today in celebration of the heritage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a milestone document which underpins all international human rights law and inspires us to continue to work to ensure that all people can gain freedom, equality, and dignity. And this year it turns 70. Human Rights Day is observed each year to commemorate the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration is defined as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, and it is considered the first universal statement that all human beings have certain inherent rights that are inalienable. It was drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all the regions of the world and was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on December 10th, 1948. Our own Eleanor Roosevelt, former UNA-USA Board Chairwoman and Trailblazer, chaired the UDHR Drafting Committee and was integral to its adoption. The Declaration itself is the most translated document in the world, available in more than 500 languages. We at the Library of Congress have decided to celebrate this remarkable anniversary by hosting an event this evening that will engage and educate all of us. Our topic tonight is the NAGPRA. I don't know if that's pronounced a different way. NAGPRA. Okay, thank you. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This act mandates the return of specific kinds of objects to Native Americans, makes illegal their trafficking across state lines, and is specific about the process and the procedures for archaeological excavations. Tonight, we are going to hear more and learn more about NAGPRA, thanks to our three panelists. And now, please allow me to introduce and welcome Sarah Glass, who is the Notice and Grant Coordinator at the National NAGPRA Program at the National Park Service, Shannon Keller O'Laughlin, the Executive Director of the Association on American Indian Affairs, and Emily Palus, sorry, I should have asked beforehand, the Deputy Division Chief of Cultural, Paleontological Resources and Tribal Consultation at the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you for joining us this evening. Shall we start? Sarah, would you please give us a bit more information and general overview of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act? What is NAGPRA?
Great question. Thanks,
Okay.
Jane. And thank you very much for having me. I'm so honored to be here tonight with my fellow panelists and excited to talk a bit about what it is I do on a day-to-day basis. So thanks. I hope everyone doesn't mind, but I am going to keep some notes, keep checking on my notes here, because as we were planning this, we were all joking about how each of us individually could talk about these things all day for hours and hours. So just as a way of keeping myself on track and making sure we have plenty of time for questions, I'm going to consult some written stuff here. It looks like I'm not the only one. So I wanted to start with a quick story, actually, to help maybe put NAGPRA in a bit of historical context. And I'm going to describe a scenario that I've taken from real life, but I'm going to kind of paraphrase it and not include quite as many factual details as I would. But imagine that it's the United States in the 1970s, and they're building a highway across a state in the Midwest. So they're digging, laying down the road, and they come across a group of burials that they had no idea. They're digging up land, and surprise, there were people on this land before we showed up and started building roads. And those burials that they uncover, they can tell from contextual clues from the items buried with the individuals that 11 of these, say 12, were those of white settlers, Anglo burials, while the 12th one, with some grave goods and objects, they could tell that it was clearly the remains of a Native American woman. So what do they do when they uncover these graves? They call in, state archaeologists. They call in the right people who are supposed to, respond to these types of situations, and they proceed to very respectfully and very carefully exhume those 11 white settlers' graves and immediately rebury them in a nearby local cemetery. Now, the 12th grave, the Native American woman, they put her bones in a box and they ship that box to a university to be studied. Because Native American peoples were not considered anything more than specimens to be collected and studied until this act, NAGPRA, was passed in 1990. So I think it's important to keep in mind that these are human beings, that these, NAGPRA has a very purposeful way of addressing some very big wrongs and historic, it's a healing process for a lot of people when dealing with it. So I just tell that story to kind of contextualize what we're all talking about today. So, and this is not a new problem. Ever since first contact, Native American peoples have been fighting to protect their rights while being treated like scientific specimens, objects for study instead of human beings. Archaeology, anthropologists, random people who felt like going out and just digging up amassed huge, massive collections that were then put into museums or onto shelves controlled by federal agencies. And unfortunately, in some parts of the world, this is still perpetuated today, this mindset of collecting, storing. I mean, you can go to the Natural History Museum, and that's where Native American topics are often covered. It's certainly changing today, but Archaeology 101, today they tell you Indiana Jones was a really, really terrible archaeologist, but that's the image that everyone has in their mind of, oh yeah, this is what a great field. So NAGPRA is inextricably linked to kind of the racial history within the United States. And it took a lot of fighting and a lot of time. The civil rights movement, the American Indian movement through the 60s and 70s were really a turning point, a pivotal moment to organize and make their voices heard in a way that they could get some change enacted in Congress. So that led to the passage of the NMAI Act, the National Museum of the American Indian Act in 1989, as well as the NAGPRA right afterwards in 1990, November 16th, 1990. And so I like to call it a very small but mighty law, because it's pretty short. It doesn't take you very long to read the whole thing, but it covers multiple areas of U.S. law. So it's administrative law, it's human rights law, it's Indian law, and it's property law. So there's a lot of different pieces and elements that are all kind of entwined and overlapping, and makes people think that it's very complicated sometimes. But what it also is at its core is a process. So it's a process for determining the rights of lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations in the human remains and certain cultural items, including funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. It applies to federal or tribal land, as well as to federal agency and museum collections. So there's a land element, a collections element. And the term museum, when I say museum, we actually, under NAGPRA, it's defined a bit more broadly than what most people think of. Museums under NAGPRA could be, it's any institution that has Native American artifacts or items and has received federal funding. So a museum under NAGPRA could be a museum as we think of it today, but it could also be a historical society, an anthropology department of a university, a county coroner's office, a police department, or even a library that has, items, historic objects. So it's not just museum in the sense that most of us think of. And it, I should add, does not apply to the Smithsonian Institution. Here we are in DC, lovely Smithsonian, because the NMAI Act that I mentioned earlier that was passed actually covers repatriation for that institution. So that's one of the things that's not covered under NAGPRA. As well as foreign institutions. NAGPRA is US law, it's domestic law. It does not apply to the international field. So essentially what NAGPRA does is it established timelines for museums and federal agencies to inventory their collections, consult with Native American tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations, and then to notify everyone of their determinations regarding cultural affiliation and repatriation through via the Federal Register. So this administrative process is just one of the major provisions under NAGPRA. There's actually 4 others that we handle. First, it established the NAGPRA Review Committee, which is a federal advisory committee that hears disputes and serves as a resolution and advisory body. They don't have any legal, their determinations have no legal bearing, but they are kind of the highest level that one can take before going to court, one's issues to be heard about NAGPRA. They also are, the other provision, another, is that we authorize grants to museums and Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations to conduct their NAGPRA work. It authorized us to assess civil penalties against museums who fail to comply with the law. And it also makes it, as Jane mentioned, illegal to traffic in Native American human remains and cultural items. So all of those kind of buckets of responsibility are overseen and enforced in part by the National NAGPRA program, of which I am one of 6 staff members, so we are also small and mighty. And we've been delegated the responsibility of implementing these provisions on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior. So we do things like we maintain public databases of the inventories and summaries that museums and federal agencies were required to put together under this law. We publish the notices in the Federal Register when they make those determinations. We award and manage grants. We support the review committee and host public meetings. And then we also assist in investigating allegations of failure to comply with the law and then with assessing civil penalties when those allegations are deemed to be valid. So I don't want to take up too much time. I want to leave lots of time for questions. But usually what I say when it comes to NAGPRA is it's an imperfect law because law is by nature imperfect, but it's an important one. And its passage was a major milestone in the ongoing, still today, the ongoing fight to right these historical wrongs that were done to the indigenous peoples of this country. So it's one small step. And I like to always mention a quote, actually, from former U.S. Representative Morris K. Udall of Arizona, who introduced the NAGPRA bill back in 1990. And he said, in the larger scope of history, this is a small thing, but in the smaller scope of conscience, it may be the biggest thing we have ever done. So with that.
Okay. Emily, how does your division and the Bureau of Land Management institutionally respond to NAGPRA procedures and requirements? Can you tell us something about the responsibilities, activities, and collaboration opportunities, perhaps?
Sure, thank you. So, in representing the Bureau of Land Management, which is an agency of the U.S. Department of the Interior, we are an implementer of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So I'll just quickly mention that the Bureau of Land Management manages about 256 million acres of public lands, largely out west in the western United States and Alaska. We're a multiple-use land management agency, meaning we strive to find balance in multiple uses of the land, so energy, oil and gas development, renewable energy, recreation, timber, grazing, while also providing conservation of wildlife habitat and preservation of archaeological sites. It's a complex mission. And we interact with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act principally in 3 avenues, which Sarah touched on. And there is I'd say in procedures, there is a bureaucratic process, but I think it's important to pause and reflect on the humanizing part of it. So we interact with NAGPRA on collections, so Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony that were recovered from agency lands, so from public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management or our predecessor agency, the General Land Office. So collections made from those lands between 1906 with enactment of the Antiquities Act, which I'll talk about in a moment, and November 16th, 1990, when NAGPRA was enacted. Those collections represent thousands of artifacts and many individuals, and I've got some figures to provide. These collections were largely made under permit under the Antiquities Act. We also respond to new discoveries, which Sarah touched on, discoveries of Native American human remains and cultural items on the public lands today. And that generally falls into 2 categories. Discovery is part of land use or development. And so if we are authorizing development, earth-moving activity, and so on in an area that is likely to contain Native American human remains and cultural items, we need to have a plan, and we develop that plan in consultation with potentially affiliated Indian tribes. We also have new discoveries that are more haphazard, in that recreational users on the public land, a hiker goes out and finds some human bone eroding out. And that can be somewhat common depending on the landscape. And as we have an increasing amount of recreation on the public lands, which has a lot of benefits, want the public to use their public lands, but with erosion and things like that, a hiker might find remains eroding out. We also have, and actually that's one of those things that I'll pause and say, we're going to talk about what NAGPRA requires federal agencies and museums to do. There's actually a provision in NAGPRA that requires anyone, including you, to act if you have reason to believe that you have found Native American human remains or other cultural items on federal or tribal lands. We all have a responsibility. And so what do? You contact the agency official. The third avenue that we interact with NAGPRA is through law enforcement. Sarah mentioned the trafficking provision of NAGPRA is illegal to traffic in Native American human remains and cultural items. We also have another law that links into this, which is the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which was enacted in 1979 and has provisions that prohibit unauthorized excavation, damage, destruction of archaeological sites on federal and Indian lands, as well as trafficking in such archaeological items. And in some ways, this is challenging, but the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is a little bit of a misnomer in that the law doesn't wholly protect a grave. So for new discoveries, it provides a process by which agencies respond if a grave is found. The same with the prohibited acts. The law enforcement section of NAGPRA is about trafficking, not unauthorized disturbance, which is sometimes a surprise for folks. I've worked with law enforcement. I've worked on all three of these provisions, and we might talk about law enforcement later, but one example I just wanted to share, because I think as a federal agency representative, I can fall into process and acronyms and things like that, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is an authority that just pulls me back into realizing the human impact of what I do. And one example is in a law enforcement action where there was a seizure and forfeiture of artifacts, and we went through and we were inventorying artifacts that were in a bucket, like the kind you get at Home Depot, a plastic bucket. And these were called perishable material, items made out of plant fibers. And there were sandals. And I think sandals and jewelry, seeing those in the archaeological record are very, those are personal adornment. And so seeing these sandals that had been taken from the public lands by people without authorization because they thought it was fun and interesting. But these sandals then came down to we had children's sandals. And so I was looking at children's sandals, and this is so real to me. These were on some child's feet, and they were now in a bucket, some prize for someone who had been looting. Our responsibilities, NAGPRA, as Sarah shared, was really pivotal in 1990, and I just want to give a little more history, because I've mentioned the Antiquities Act, and I've mentioned the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. So in 1906, Congress enacted the law for the preservation of American antiquities, and at the time, it was really this pivotal moment where it established this federal policy that archaeological sites were important and should be preserved for the benefit of all Americans. They shouldn't be mined as commercial resources. And it established, among other things, a permitting process by which only those that were deemed reputable to do the excavations. And so this was designed to protect sites, but and my agency, or the Department of Interior, issued permits, hundreds, thousands of investigations at which archaeological sites, ruins, Native American ancestral homes, cemeteries were excavated. And this was federal policy that this was expanding the knowledge. And so human remains, among other items, ended up on shelves and boxes in museums. And some were studied, and some were not. The Archaeological Resource Protection Act, also enacted in 1979, to address actually some failures of the Antiquities Act, which has a protection clause too. But that reaffirmed some of the permitting provisions, and again reaffirmed federal policy that archaeological sites on federal and Indian lands were important resources to be preserved and studied for the benefit of all Americans. Again, permitting excavation work, and the collections had to go to a public museum. And so the idea in 1990 that there are groups of people that have a higher right than the American public at large. And so the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is a real shift in U.S. policy, whereas before, Interior and other federal agencies would authorize the removal in the interests of science and education and public benefit. This changes that and recognizes that descendant communities have the right to control the disposition of their ancestors and cultural property, and indigenous people in the United States do too. So that's some of the history. So I wanted to give you a few statistics for my agency, Bureau of Land Management. On the collection side, we have inventoried more than 2,100 sets of Native American human remains. Of those, we determined 1,600 were culturally affiliated with an Indian tribe, and have repatriated just about 1,200 of those individuals. We have also had countless discoveries of Native American human remains on the public lands and responded in about 50 different instances where those individuals were then turned over to tribes. You asked about how our division operates, and I wanted to share a case study, which I think might speak to that. So I'm in the Washington office, or Washington, D.C. office of my bureau, and there are offices across the West. And largely, we have an archaeologist in each of our state offices who is tasked with a variety of roles, including NAGPRA responsibilities for collections, and I have the honor of working with them and supporting them on their day-to-day tasks. And there's a project in particular that really has affected me in many ways. It involves individuals and collections from Alaska, and I'll begin with, I studied archaeology, and I worked as an archaeologist in the private sector in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. But I've learned a whole lot about Alaska, chasing collections that were made by this researcher who worked between 1948 and 1980. And he made 20 trips to the Aleutian Islands. And over my 12 years working on this project, we have found collections in Massachusetts, Oregon, Wisconsin, Connecticut, Michigan, Alaska, Finland. Some of those collections we could find using a paper trail, like permit records. Others, no. Some of the work was done under permit, some was not. Most collections were made from a singular village and a mound that represents about 4,000 years of occupation. And I would say we published a notice of inventory completion in 2008 for 222 ancestral remains. And since then, and those were the ones that were found in Wisconsin and Connecticut. And since then, we have found many more. And we are in the process of consolidating those collections from multiple institutions at the University of Alaska Museum of the North in Fairbanks, because these collections actually represent, or we might find some human remains in one repository, and then looking at field notes that we've located in archives in another repository, and marry that up with funerary objects that are in another repository. And so it really is a puzzle to pull back together. We found that it's important to go through all of that process to make these people whole, these graves returned whole, and it really is a long process, and I'm sometimes amazed at where we find information. Let's see, what else can I tell you about this? One aspect is I've read this individual's dissertation, and there's a skull that's presented in the dissertation, which I thought I would find in the university where he went to university, and it wasn't there. So now I'm thinking maybe he took it with him to his first teaching post, and I'm trying to work with that institution to gain information about the collections that are there. You asked about partnerships, and I would say that museums and universities that hold federally controlled collections can be wonderful partners to collaborate with through this thoughtful process, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're very difficult to work with. And what's a challenge for federal agencies, for mine, and at times, is that we don't have physical custody of the collections. We may not have much in the way of records. All of that could be in the institution or in multiple institutions, and so we end up relying upon museums to share information. And yet it is our federal responsibility under NAGPRA to pursue and complete the process leading towards repatriation. I'd also say this sort of thinking about family members. This researcher's since passed away, but his family members have subsequently turned in collections that he made. And so this is really kind of an incredible puzzle, and I think about this was all done in the interest of science. And I look at how much he published. And it really is hard sometimes to reconcile the public, how you all have benefited from these 20 trips to the Aleutians and I'm sure at some point, hundreds and hundreds of individuals. And what have we learned? And a lot of these researchers published and a lot didn't. And so when it comes to one of the challenges that we had in archaeology when NAGPRA was first enacted was, oh, but these individuals have so much information, scientific information, we need to study them before they're returned and they're lost forever. And when I've gone through museums and I've seen boxes that have been untouched for 50 years, sometimes I frankly wonder, well, you know, we had our chance. I think I might leave it there and see where we go with questions on my agency's role.
Okay, thank you. Shannon, is the Association on American Indian Affairs satisfied with everything that NAGPRA provides? What would you like to see next? That's kind of a loaded question, sorry.
What do y'all think? Thank you. I'll be nice. Thank you. And let me tell you a little bit about the Association on American Indian Affairs, just to kind of get me warmed up and give me a chance to kind of not be emotional about that question. So the Association on American Indian Affairs is the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country. We've been around since 1922. And I don't know how much you know about the history of the United States and Indian tribes, but in 1922, that was a time when federal policy was to assimilate Indians. And assimilation took many forms. One form was boarding schools, kidnapping children and taking them far, far away from their homes and putting them in boarding schools where oftentimes they suffered, they passed there, they were buried in marked graves, unmarked graves. Allotment was another policy, which was a process by which the federal government sectioned off pieces of land and gave certain acreage to individuals who were Indian and took away communal ownership from that tribe, from that particular tribe. And that the allotment process that went on all over the United States took away about 9 million acres of Indian lands at that time. There was also, ceremonies, language, dancing, practicing religions and cultures. All of these were outlawed. In those boarding schools, you couldn't speak your language. You couldn't practice your religions or ceremonies. And the federal government often turned those boarding schools over to religions, Christian religions, to help the assimilation process of Indian children. And during the time in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, it was very popular to loot and steal our ancestors and objects that were in the ground, as well as our cultural items that were part of everyday practices, everyday way of life, for healing, for medicine, for identity. And the two reasons that Congress studied why, what were the biggest problems with all of this came from, one was the competition between institutions and museums to see who could get the most stuff. And so they would send oftentimes archaeologists, anthropologists, and other people to obtain items from tribes all over the country. And then, of course, science and the study of of our ancestral remains and other items for the benefit of the United States. And what happened was all of these things wound up in institutions all over the world, but there was also a segment that ended up creating the art market, what's known as a market of tribal antiquities. And one of the failings of NAGPRA is that it's very checkerboarded in what it protects. It protects and repatriates items that are in federal agencies and within federal hands, but does not protect the same types of items that are held by private collections all over the world. So some of the things that the Association on American Indian Affairs is doing to kind of change the direction of this federal policy is changing how the public sees our cultural items and our cultural patrimony. That these items are not for commercial purposes. They weren't made for sale, but are just part of the history of looting and inequality and the lack of human rights, of why these items are in private collections and up on people's walls and decorating their homes or for sale at auction houses all over the country. We recently put out a press release with multiple national organizations, both native and non-native organizations, tribes, and firms that do archaeological work, and universities that basically tells the world that these items are part of our cultural practices. They're sacred and cultural patrimony. They're not part of the commercial market, and instead, those people that are interested in Native cultures should be looking towards contemporary Native American artists to invest in instead of our cultural patrimony and our cultural history. Now, the association was very much involved in the passage of NAGPRA, and it started with trying to move forward an agenda about American Indian religious freedom, which wasn't very successful. But out of that came the NMAI Act and NAGPRA, which at that time was an extremely successful piece of legislation because it was the first time that Congress said that corrective measures needed to be taken based on the failure to enact proper human rights legislation, proper civil rights legislation to protect Native Americans and Native Hawaiian organizations. So this was the first piece of legislation known as human rights legislation within the federal Indian law framework. So at the time it was extremely successful, and I think tribes and indigenous peoples, what we thought was going to happen were these wonderful relationships with institutions and working towards the return of these items. And that has happened with some federal agencies and some institutions. But today it's been almost 30 years. Are we on 27 now? 28? Years after the passage of NAGPRA, and there's, my fellows at NAGPRA know the data better than I do, but 180,000 ancestors? Under 190 ancestral remains, 190,000 ancestors are still within institutions, and that's what we know from institutions who have actually shared that information. There are still institutions that are completely out of compliance with NAGPRA. For example, recently there was a city library in Massachusetts, Medford Public Library, Massachusetts, that was getting rid of some items and making a little money for its own budget, and took its Native American collection that was gifted to them back in the 1880s and put it up for auction at Skinner Auction in Boston. There was a immediate uproar by Native American communities, and Medford Library and the town of Medford quickly learned about NAGPRA, because that, if the Skinner auction would have sold those items, they could have been held criminally responsible for violating NAGPRA. As it stands now, Medford remains potentially liable under civil penalties for NAGPRA because they have not fulfilled their NAGPRA obligations of inventorying or providing summaries of their collections and consulting with tribes so that they could proceed with repatriation efforts. I don't have any really nice quote or ending piece for this, but the work of the association is led by tribes, academics, museums, lawyers, working together to try to push and change the direction of federal policy so that it's more protective of our cultural heritage. And part of that is educating the public about the importance of our cultural heritage and how it's still lacking the kind of protection that is seen in other countries. I'm fortunate enough to still be an Obama appointee, still fulfilling my term in the State Department in the Cultural Property Advisory Committee, which is a FACA committee. And this committee oversees the 1970 UNESCO Convention that works with other governments to help protect their cultural patrimony. And so what the CPAC does is help to recommend to the State Department whether the U.S. should enter into a memorandum of agreement to help protect another country's cultural patrimony from being imported into the U.S. So if we see certain types of cultural patrimony for from another country, we let it be known and give it back. But those same types of protections aren't available for Native American cultural patrimony and heritage. And we are still working on legislation called the Safeguarding Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act. It's currently in Congress, and it's maybe not going to be passed in this Congress, but we're hoping next Congress it will. And what it does is it helps remedy that one-sided mechanism where the U.S. is only protecting other countries' cultural patrimony. Instead, it allows the U.S. to develop bilateral agreements with other countries who are market countries from Native American items such as Germany, France, and other parts of Europe, so that they will protect our items if they see them being imported into their countries. The STOP Act also has an exportation requirement. So when Homeland Security or TSA sees certain types of items that are going to be shipped over to other countries, there would be a process in place to help protect Native American cultural items. So there is movement to expand current protections for Native American cultural heritage, but we still have a long way to go, and part of that has to do with changing perceptions of the antiquities market and antiquities dealer who makes a lot of money from these items. I was once involved in stopping the sale of some wampum belts, which many northeastern tribes have used throughout their history and are no different than our Declaration of Independence. It's that type of national cultural patrimony. And some of these wampum belts have gone for $100,000 or more. And so being able to stop the sale of that, as you can imagine, would be quite difficult because of the financial interest that collector has in a particular item. So, but that's what AAIA is doing, is trying to work with the public, work with collectors, work with auction houses to try to find options of how to return those types of patrimony, since NAGPRA and other law may not apply. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Okay. I have a couple more prepared questions, but I thought I'd go ahead and open it up to all of you to ask questions yourself. So, anyone? Oh, come on. Back in the corner.
Hi, I actually have two questions. You said that you had found some remains all the way back in Finland, and I'm wondering if it's harder sometimes to get those from other countries because you have international laws that you have to go through as well, and they might not, since they're further removed from the history, they might, I don't know if they can grasp its importance as much. And then my other question is, this is not really something that's new. We have mummies in display on museums that were taken from the graves in Egypt and other cultures who have artifacts taken from their burial sites throughout the world. Is there something that you guys do, because this is a very self-selected group, to outreach the public to sort of make that culture change so that we can start viewing these things as this is a human, this is a body, as opposed to putting it on display to study?
Well, I'll start with the international. Thank you for picking up on that. So the Finland loan, or the Finland trade, is something that I'm working on, but I'll start with, there's a collection, another collection from Alaska, not associated with the researcher I talked about, another researcher, that the collection we discovered in Switzerland. And the university, poor professor took a call from someone's child, adult child, who said, I'm cleaning out my father's house. Would you be interested in coming over and you can have any of the archaeological stuff? So he answered, so he went over, and lo and behold, it's about 120 boxes of artifacts that were actually recovered as part of a permitted excavation. I've gotten a copy of the permit, and were to be curated in Fairbanks, Alaska, but were shipped to Switzerland as part of this researcher was going to do analysis and then return them. That must have slipped through the cracks because that was in the late 60s, early 1970s. So that collection is we learned this last year when the professor who took the fateful call, he went and he salvaged the material from this residence, and he has it in his lab and is working with his students to repackage it because it was in no condition to ship. And it has been it's been a wonderful collaboration. This is my first international foray, so I'm grateful to have a good partner, and we've met with State Department, Homeland Security, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and so I'm working through those with a collaborative. We haven't wholly broached Finland yet, the Finnish institution, because we're trying to get copies of the loan documentation from the museum that did. I keep calling it a loan. It's not a loan, that they did the transfer. So, but we get this one project under our belts, then we'll go for the others. Now, it can be complicated because we are talking about international lines, and in some instances, it's U.S. policy to send examples of our artwork and historical items overseas to spread information about American culture. But for us, what we will tie back to is our domestic laws, that these were collected from public lands. They remain federal property that cannot be conveyed except under current law repatriated to culturally affiliated Indian tribes. So I think that the other question.
Well, I wanted to I wanted to respond to the international question too, because one of the difficulties that we have trying to get collections back from international institutions is that those countries have their own laws that often declares that those things that they hold are their national patrimony. So, for example, Spain was a conquering country of indigenous peoples and took a lot of items back to Spain, and there are items in Spain that are now part of their cultural patrimony, even though they were looted and stolen and taken from the indigenous peoples here. So it becomes a different kind of discussion that you have with an international government, and you have to go through their laws as well. And one thing that is often not addressed, even though these items have a federal tie-in, they came from federal lands, they are part of what's kind of considered federal property, even though I don't like to consider our ancestral remains and remains and cultural items in that way. And so they're inalienable from the federal government, but Native Americans' items, which are inalienable to us, it is very difficult for us to argue to collectors and others that there are items that are inalienable to us and to our nations that no one has the authority to give away. And the only reason why they're in other people's hands is through theft and looting or some kind of illegitimate taking. So it's great that we have that federal tie-in with many items, but there are still many more where we don't have that federal tie-in, and we don't have any strong federal law that will support the argument that these are our inalienable items that could not have been taken except through theft. But I totally missed your second question.
I was just asking, like, if you guys do education or outreach programs to sort of shift or create that culture shift to where people see these items for what they are, as like funerary items or human remains, and humanize them as opposed to just looking at them behind glass.
I mean, yeah, we a big part of what the National NAGPRA program does is offer training, resources, technical assistance to museums that, obviously since we're the NAGPRA program, we are focused on NAGPRA items, domestic issues, but that doesn't mean that we don't still try to get involved in this kind of broader culture shift and this broader application of this work. So for example, my boss, Melanie O'Brien, who's the manager of the National NAGPRA program, actually traveled with an interagency delegation to France earlier this year, to Paris, to try to educate and meet with government officials there, art officials, to talk about why are these Paris auctions of sacred Native American items such a big deal? Why do we care? Because there's just not that recognition, right? Or even the language, even the translations. When you say a sacred object, and that has a very specific meaning under U.S. law and to different tribes over here, when you say sacré in French, that doesn't necessarily equate in the same way. So yes, we do try to do our best to educate to the extent under the law, for me at least, being restricted by that. When I do get calls about people asking about, mummies or other kind of grave goods, I remember being shocked when I went through, to Italy and went through museums and just saw body after body after body from Vesuvius and was kind of taken aback by that. But it's just a more normal practice still, I would say, in some parts of the world. But here, luckily, with that kind of shift in these fields in archaeology, I was an archaeologist undergrad and anthropologist and museum studies. That's the new guard, I think, moving in to start shifting our perceptions of that, and not just because NAGPRA says you have to, but because this is what's the right thing to do as well. So I think that's the direction that most people, not everyone, but most people are tending towards. Maybe I'm optimistic.
If I could, I want to touch on this too, because I think a lot of it comes down to consent of the descendant community and what is a cultural norm. And so what's so pivotal about NAGPRA is that it describes that, well, the federal government actually had this policy that excavating and study and display was in the public interest, and then reversed that because recognizing that Indian people, Native American people, have the right to control the disposition of their ancestors, and of the 500 and plus tribes and Native Alaskan communities, not everyone has the exact same worldview. And there are some tribes that will take remains and rebury them on their lands. There are some tribes that will take remains and rebury them as close to the original interment as possible. There are some tribes that allow study. There are some tribes that allow intrusive study. It's their consent, and I think is what it comes down to, is consent. But I agree that sometimes it's sort of shocking when you walk into a museum and see human remains everywhere. I was doing a behind-the-scenes tour repository review of an institution that held federal collections, and we walked into the physical anthropology labs, physical anthropology, human remains, and the curator opened up these wardrobe doors, and there was just shelves of skulls, and I fell back because I didn't know that was coming, and even if I'm not Native American, I think a little heads up would have been, excuse me, a little warning that this was happening, and then there was that one of my colleagues gasped, and she said, "Oh no, it's okay. They're from Peru. They're not subject to NAGPRA, so it's okay." And then also, actually, at the same institution, and now the story I'm telling is about from 15 years ago. They've changed course dramatically, but there was a display of you push the button, so it was interactive. You push the button, and there's this woman on the phone. Says, hello, I found something in my garage. And the story is that this woman went into her garage, and there was a box, and she opened up the box. And there was naturally mummified human remains. And the story was that her husband or his friends had gone over to Mexico and brought them back. Not sure how they ended up at this museum, but the story and how it was presented was this kind of, oh my gosh, this woman walked into her garage and found this box with mummified remains in it. And no, that kind of display that actually, was sensational, but that's just not appropriate. And I think that story is changing. I guess the last thing I want to say is I'm grateful for this opportunity to come here and talk to this group about this statute with my esteemed colleagues.
Thanks. And to talk a little bit about public education and what opportunities there are for you all, the Association on American Indian Affairs is a membership nonprofit organization, and anyone can be a member if you pay $35, which is actually very powerful for the work we do. We do a lot of national public education and advocacy, as well as grassroots work on the ground with tribes implementing programs on the ground. So having a membership that's representative of all of us in the United States, I think really tells a strong story about some of the issues in the programs and the education we're trying to do, that we're backed by a diverse community of individuals, not just Indigenous Americans, but everyone. So I encourage you to participate in some of the programs the association has. We just got done with a repatriation conference where there were tribal practitioners, spiritual leaders, museum curators, foreign institutions, lawyers, and a variety of people working together to find ways towards more success in repatriation efforts, not just with NAGPRA, but also those things that fall outside of NAGPRA or in foreign institutions. So there are opportunities to be educated, and I think there's a lot in the media right now. So if you search auctions, Native American cultural items, if you look on the association's website, you're going to find a lot of information available for you.
Yeah, it is becoming more well-known, for sure. These issues are getting attention now, like never before. So that's a positive thing.
Yeah, but the sad thing to me is that it wasn't until 1990. Wow.
Yeah.
Yikes. That's terrible. Anyone else? Oh, come on. Ah.
So you said that the NAGPRA program is an imperfect law. Are there other countries that are doing it right or have it a little bit closer that you kind of hold as, oh, this is how they're doing it, like maybe we can take things from them? Or are we like doing the best we can and we're kind of at the end, beginning of it?
That's a good question. That's a great question. Yeah, so it's been almost 30 years since NAGPRA was passed, and I think it's safe to say that no one that was drafting NAGPRA 30 years ago really thought that this work was still going to be going on now in the way that it has. And as we've mentioned, the statistics are still kind of mind-boggling about just how much is still left to do, and there's gaps, as we've pointed out. So there are other countries that have laws in place to address these similar types of issues, Australia being one of them, New Zealand, Canada. Other countries that have these kind of histories of indigenous populations, imperialistic, people moving in, power imbalances that are inherent in then the power that takes the country that takes power. I don't. Maybe someone else can speak to if they're doing any better than what NAGPRA's doing. But I know that often this is used as an example of how you can at least try to shift that power imbalance and try to start doing that work of righting past wrongs. I know another international kind of outreach thing that the National NAGPRA program did. We actually sent staff to Japan because they have a very strong centralized program for acknowledging and putting on a list their national treasures, their things that they consider national cultural treasures, from dance to art to all sorts of things. And so that was a kind of cross-cultural learning experience about, how do you do it? And it really just comes down to every country is different, every situation is different. The United States has such strong protections of personal property and that property law that can get so gray sometimes or so hard to fight when it's private property. And that I don't ever see the United States saying, yeah, we're going to take your private property because it's the right thing to do. But, sorry, I rambled there. But.
Well, I'm looking for a day that we will have some kind of mechanism to allow the taking of stolen property. And as I said earlier, most of the cultural patrimony and sacred patrimony and funerary items and human remains were taken illegitimately because they could be considered inalienable from those nations, from those tribes. NAGPRA really is the, hate to say the word gold standard, but it is really the best out there for a process by which indigenous peoples can have the items repatriated back to them. Other countries are much better at protecting their national heritage than we are, and don't checkerboard the protections up like the United States does because of that private property type of mentality that we have here in the U.S. So in other countries you see mechanisms by which all land is protected. So no one can go in and start digging and all of a sudden declare ownership of that human burial or of those items that they found in the ground. And it's not like that here. And what's even more interesting is that we do have federal law in the United States that's highly prohibitive of the same type of private property issue when it comes to endangered species and collecting and or selling endangered species, such as the Golden Eagle and Bald Eagle Protection Act. So if I'm standing at my house and a bald eagle dies and falls in front of me, I have absolutely no right to that animal or parts of that animal. I have to call someone to take it. But if I find something in my land, if I find amazing pottery or even human remains, depending on what state I live in, there may be no other laws that protect the affiliated tribe's rights to those things, and I can start my own museum in my garage with what I find in my own on my own private property. So there's a little bit of a disparate thinking, unconnected thinking when we're looking at protection of Native American cultural heritage, and it's really goes back into how our federal laws apply to indigenous peoples, which is based on this kind of schizophrenic notion that tribes and Indian peoples are sovereign, but at the same time they're inferior. And so depending on the whims of the current administration, oftentimes our federal policies protecting Native Americans and Native American heritage kind of swings one way or the other because our federal laws are so schizophrenic when protecting indigenous peoples here.
Hi, I really don't have a question, but I just wanted to kind of piggyback a comment in response to that question. So I'm the interim director of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. Prior to, I was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for my tribe in Lac du Flambeau, Wisconsin. I started under a NAGPRA grant, not knowing anything about NAGPRA. Never even knew that my ancestral remains were in museums and other institutions. So it's been incredible education that I've had since the year 2000. What I have seen in that time, thanks to NAGPRA, a lot of ancestors are returning home. A lot of their belongings are returning home. And that's been phenomenal. What I've also seen in my own community is we are beefing up our tribal codes and ordinances to protect our ancestral remains and their resting places, but also the states. I'm starting to see more states take that on. Wisconsin just passed a revised burial sites preservation law that protects burials, categorized or cataloged or uncatalogued, and it actually empowered our intertribal repatriation committee in Wisconsin when ancestral remains are discovered during certain projects, excavations, whether it's on private land or public land, it is left up to the Intertribal Repatriation Committee to determine disposition of those human remains, where they're going to be repatriated, reburied, what happens with them. So on top of what we have federally, we're starting to see tribes and states take a more proactive approach in beefing up their laws to prohibit and protect ancestral burial remains.
Okay. I think it's time to begin our closing. I'd like to thank everyone involved in making this panel possible. Shannon, Emily, and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you all for spending your evening with us and celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've come a long way since the adoption of the Declaration, but we must also acknowledge that we have not lived up to its full vision. So as we celebrate tonight, we must also commit to working harder to make the Declaration's ideals a reality in people's lives. We must support the work of human rights defenders, non-governmental organizations, experts, policymakers, journalists, and all peoples of conscience. And we must continue until the timeless and universal principles in the Declaration become not just an inspiration or an aspiration, but the foundation of life for all of the world's people. Thank you once again, and have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.